Hi, I'm Rob McCool, the Library Director. We are thrilled tonight to introduce Jay Gitlin, a Yale history lecturer. He's going to talk about what we're calling the rebranding of Connecticut. Connecticut Circle Magazine, 1938 to 1952. Loretta Lyons, who does the programming here, always gives me a little snippet about our guests. Quite a bit of illustrious information here, but what really struck me is just how much of a life Jay has with Yale. He did his BA at Yale, his master's, his PhD at Yale. He's currently a Yale history lecturer, and he teaches a seminar called Yale in America. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jay Gitlin.
So great to see you all. And I just will say a fast word. I want to thank Loretta Lyons and Rob McCool for inviting me. This is great. And so 2 words about the Acorn Club. It's a small group of some historians, some book collectors. It's been around since 1899, and it exists to promote the history of Connecticut, to make it accessible. So every other year, more or less, they publish a book, usually of what we call, historians call primary sources, ways to look at the original documents and study the history of the state. And so normally, very often I should say, the Acorn Club has published books about the Revolutionary period, the colonial period. We're all very proud of the lineage of the state, often the Civil War period. And as we were sitting around talking, I said, shouldn't we at some point do something a little bit more recent about Connecticut as it was yesterday? The Connecticut that perhaps some of you grew up in, your parents grew up in. So that's what this book is about. But it really started when our son Basie brought home a couple of issues of a magazine that somebody had brought in from their attic to Whitlock's, and he brought a couple of copies home for me, and I'm going to pass this around. But it was called Connecticut Circle Magazine. How many people have ever heard of this magazine? Okay, so it started publishing in 1938 in January. And I looked, I said, this is curious. It's sort of glossy, and it's like a life magazine just for the state of Connecticut. Just to give you a brief bit of history about the magazine, it started out like a house of fire for about a decade. So until the late 40s, maybe early 50s, it was fairly substantial, had a lot of nice photographs and interesting articles. So it started trailing off in the 50s. By 1970, they were bankrupt. And another company bought it, and they changed the name to Connecticut Magazine. So it's what is today Connecticut Magazine, which I found out is owned by the Hearst company. So let me pass this around so you can take a look. And again, it's a surprise. They had really nice, this is the November issue, you can see turkeys on the cover. So it was kind of a very nice thing. Just about Connecticut. So I would say about 90% of this book are reprinted articles, again, primary sources, if you want to study what Connecticut was like and how it changed in the late 30s, 40s, and 50s. To begin with, and I'm leafing through this, I'll just share a little bit of what I discovered and tell you why we included some of the articles in this book. So what was the state of the state in this period? As you might expect, they do cover World War II. So one of the things we reprinted was this photograph of Florence Duquette. She's sort of like Connecticut's own Rosie the Riveter. She was working in the General Electric plant in Bridgeport, and this is from the June 1943 issue. So there's an article on Bridgeport brass and what they were doing for the war effort. There are several articles that we reprinted by Igor Sikorsky, who talking about one of the titles of one of his articles. It's called Recent Developments in the Direct Lift Aircraft. He never called it the helicopter. He always called it the direct lift aircraft. There is an article and a picture of this man that we reprinted, Judge John Lee Gilson, who was the leader of the Second Company of the Governor's Foot Guard, one-time president of the New Haven Colony Historical Society, and also Maury's. And so there were lots of things about current events, as you might expect. World War II, there was an article by Charles Seymour, who was president of Yale at the time, about Yale's efforts to support the war effort. The war, they trained soldiers there. My dad was actually stationed at Yale during World War II to learn Japanese. And so you get a sense of all this from this cover from February 1945, The Connecticut Worker and the Idea of Victory. And I think over there, the best way to strike is while the iron is hot. And this might not surprise you, but you see there at Connecticut Industry, so it's the Connecticut Worker supporting the war and the fires of patriotism. More often than not in the magazine, and not Luce, but Morse, the publisher, was very old guard, very conservative. He was not a pro-labor guy, and that will not shock you. So one of the messages oftentimes in the magazine was, whatever you do, don't strike, because that's bad for the war, it's bad for the country. But at the same time, they celebrated the Connecticut worker. So that's part of what you find. There's also many articles in the magazine on inventions, things being invented in Connecticut and Connecticut industry. I found out that the tackling dummy in football was invented in Connecticut. Okay, and you can see an ad here. There are a lot of local products being advertised. So you see this ad, which we reprinted in the book for the Mounds Bar, which was started. Anybody know where of course, some of you may know the Mounds Bar in Almond Joy was made in Naugatuck, but do you know where it started? It started in New Haven. There were two brothers who started it. Their last name was Halagian, and their first names were?
Peter Paul.
Of course, yes. And so there's the ad for that. Another thing that started in Connecticut, you see this ad on the right for telemusic, which is what became Muzak. So Muzak, also invented in Connecticut. That's not a good thing. You saw many articles on transportation. There was an article which we reprinted that said, proposed cure for Hartford traffic. They all got a big chuckle out of that, since obviously whatever the proposed cure was, it didn't work. That was from December 1945, and then this article is also in the book. It is a proposed location for the international, not just local, not just national, the international airport in Norwich, New London. I looked into this and I said, really? They were going to put an airport in Norwich, New London? Turns out the very first airfield in the state of Connecticut was in Norwich. It's like, I would never have guessed that. There's also articles on new roads and bridges being built. For example, the Baldwin Bridge, which was named for Governor Raymond Baldwin, and of course the Wilbur Cross Parkway, named for Governor Wilbur Cross. There were articles about every private school in Connecticut, and also the Connecticut Agricultural Station that becomes UConn. And of course there were articles about celebrities from Connecticut, Rosalind Russell, who was from Waterbury, Katharine Hepburn. They could not love Katharine Hepburn enough. She appeared on 3 or 4 different covers, and always it said, "Our Kate." I love that. I also found out one of the celebrities that was profiled, and we put this in the book, was the voice of Snow White, the Disney movie that came out in 1938. Turns out the voice of Snow White was a teenage girl from Bridgeport, whose name was Adriana Castellotti. Huh. And another one of my favorites was Tony Lavelli, who was a basketball star at Yale. In 1949, he was an All-American. He played for 2 seasons in the NBA with the Boston Celtics. And so we reprinted this as well. What I loved about Tony Lavelli, he not only was a basketball star, he played the accordion. And apparently, at halftime, when he was playing for the Celtics, he would get out the Boston Gardens and he would serenade everybody on the accordion. So we tried to reprint some things that would really convey the atmosphere, the environment of Connecticut in these years, the late 30s to 40s. But as I was looking at all this, I'm leafing through this, and the historian in me started getting curious. I said, okay, I get it, World War II, all that, but there's something else going on here, and I wasn't sure what it is. And the more I looked, the more I thought, this is a little bit like looking at one of those real estate magazines. And so I said, there's a real estate thing going on here. And then, I don't know how many of you have ever gone to the flea market out in Clinton. Okay, so I go there once the summer hits, every once in a while, and I found 2 programs from the tercentennial celebration of New Haven, which happened in 1938, the same year that this magazine, Connecticut Circle, started publishing. And I'm going to show you the covers from these two programs. Again, here's 1938. Here's one. I said, well, this is curious. It's like there's a Puritan with his gun, his musket, behind his oxen. Now that's fine. So it's the past, but it looks like he's gazing into the future, into the clouds. And what does he see in the clouds? What's there? Skyscrapers. Now look, here's the second cover. It's the same thing. It's not the same artist, but now you've got an Indian and a Puritan, and they're looking into the future from, see, if we're standing where they're standing, it's the past. And they're looking out into the future. And the future looks suspiciously like New York City. And I said, what is this all about? This is very curious. And I'll just show you both of them again. 1938, celebrating the tercentennial. And then it started, it's like, they're staring out at the future, and the future, I think, scared them. Is this what's to become of us? Are we to be like New York? Oh my God, that's not good. That's not a good thing. It's like, will we lose whatever the pleasures of being, and somehow we'll wind up like New York? So I thought this was sort of an odd thing to worry about in the middle of the Depression. And then it hit me, trying to put this all together. In 1938, when Connecticut Circle magazine began publishing, many leaders and residents of the state were anxious about the future. And no wonder, because the farming life, vestiges of the farming life were disappearing. And at the same time, of course, industry was in decline. It was a depression. And it revived somewhat during the war, but it was still in decline. So I think they were asking themselves at this moment of sort of celebration of the tercentennial, not only of New Haven in 1938, but of the state of Connecticut in 1935, this was a moment to take a deep breath and say, who are we and where are we going? What are we to become in the middle of this depression? So I think there was an anxiety that's captured perfectly in this covers. And then I realized, Connecticut Circle magazine is not simply a news magazine with features, it's a real estate prospectus, selling an image of the state. Because they were trying to attract tourists, but also people buying second homes or even first homes to become full-time residents. This was a case of rebranding Connecticut. That's what they were up to. And once that hit me, I said, oh, now it all makes sense. So I'm going to take you through the year of 1938. So in January, the magazine begins to publish. In June, the Merritt Parkway opens. And in September, and this, by the way, is the very first day of the Parkway. You can see how pristine it is. And it was being advertised because there are no tolls for like 40 miles. This was the best thing ever. All right? Now, that's June. In September, the hurricane of 1938 hit. And here you see a picture, the upper one is Hartford, totally underwater. The hurricane of 38, the eye actually went over New Haven, and it devastated everything to the east. And the eastern part of Connecticut is the oldest part of Connecticut. So the truly old part of Connecticut is everything up from Mystic and Saybrook, all the way up towards Hartford and into Massachusetts. People sometimes think Fairfield County is the oldest part of the state. No, it's actually the newest part of the state. It was the last to be settled and developed. So the oldest part of the state is actually devastated by the hurricane. So June is the Merritt Parkway, September is the hurricane, and then in November, the kindly old New Deal Democrat governor, Wilbur Cross, is replaced by a Republican named Raymond Baldwin. Or my shorthand is, the highway is replaced by the bridge. And in case you don't know what Wilbur Cross looks like, here he is getting a kiss on the cheek from an opera star at the time, Lily Pons. And I have to tell you a fast little story about Wilbur Cross, who had retired as the dean of the graduate school, Yale Graduate School. He was an English professor, ran for governor. He was described, when I was trying to read up more about him, he was described actually in a book by Joe Lieberman on the politics of Connecticut in this period, as a Grover Cleveland Democrat. And I thought, okay, what's that? I have no idea. And I looked it up. And it turns out a Grover Cleveland Democrat, just in case you want to know, is somebody who's fiscally conservative but socially liberal. So that was Wilbur Cross. But the story I heard later on, I was sitting at a party at Yale next to a guy who takes care of all the organs at Yale. And he said he had joined Maury's and he was sitting at a dinner that was to honor Wilbur Cross. Because there's a room upstairs at Maury's called the Governor's Room. And I always thought it was the Board of Governors of Maury's, but no, it was to honor Wilbur Cross. Because if you've ever been to Maury's, the clubhouse there, that old white house, that used to be the home of Wilbur Cross. That's where he lived. And so this gentleman went to this party and he was sitting next to, Wilbur Cross had long since died, but his oldest son was there and he was very elderly. And at this party, this celebration, he sat next to Wilbur Cross's son. And so they were in this upstairs room. And the son was musing, he said, my dad really liked this room. He spent a lot of time here. He said, oh, is that right? Yes, it was the maid's room. So, there's kindly Wilbur Cross. We'll leave him now. So, reading about, now with sort of new eyes, I'm reading Connecticut Circle, and it's not only about the news. I realized this is something we reprinted. It's an ad from the very first issue. And it's an ad from the Greenwich Trust Company, because Greenwich is just beginning to grow into what it is today. It was really starting out, of course, the Mary Parker was bringing all these people into Connecticut. So that's what the magazine was all about. And here you see an ad that just captures the spirit of the times. Greenwich has many residential advantages. So I think what they were trying to say, it's like if our future is not industrial, and if it's not agricultural, maybe it's residential. And this is what almost every ad seems to say. Come to Connecticut because we have, and this is always the list, fine schools, check, okay. An easy commute in 1938, apparently. Low taxes, again, in 1938. And the other thing that they always emphasize is colonial homes and history. So, of course, they're trying, history, I realize, is being used as a kind of amenity. It's like, come here to Connecticut, because we have a colonial past. It's almost like, come here and share our lineage, our past, in an era where there's increasing industrialization, immigration. People are saying, it's like, where can I go that's sort of an all-American place? Like Connecticut is. We have colonial homes. And I meant to bring a copy of the book over here so I could read you this, but I will just get it really quickly. So how many people have ever seen the movie with Cary Grant and Myrna Loy, Mr. Blandings Builds His Dream House? Okay, there you go. So I think there's a fast bit of dialogue, which I wrote into the introduction here, and took from the movie. So I just have to read this to you. So Cary Grant, so the story, if you don't know, he's up there with Myrna Loy. They have a nice middle. He's an advertising man. They live in Manhattan, but they're thinking to get away from the rat race. They're thinking about, they have this dream of moving to Connecticut. So they're being shown a home that's going to turn out to eat up all their money. It was remade as The Money Pit, a later movie, but parts are going to collapse, so it's going to be a real mess. But they're being sold this by this sort of sharp Connecticut real estate man named Smith. So Mr. Smith said, you're buying a piece of American history. So Jim Blandings, played by Cary Grant, says, you don't say. How's that? Smith, why, the first year she was built, General Gates stopped right here to water his horses. Blandings, General Gates, Civil War. Smith, Revolutionary War. Oh, that General Gates, says Cary Grant. So, God forbid it's the Civil War. No, it's the Revolutionary War. We go way back. So, this is part of the sales pitch. Look how old we are. Look how venerable we are. We're historical. You know, we have, in fact, somebody in the Hartford thing said, so if we were going to rebrand Connecticut here, would the slogan be still colonial? And I said, yeah, I think so. You know, because we still have that. Now, they wanted people to move up to Connecticut. Use the Merritt Parkway, it's a beautiful road. You know, at first, they decided they were not going to link the Merritt Parkway to the Hutchinson River Parkway. They weren't going to do it. Why wouldn't you do that? Well, because that might bring in New Yorkers. They wanted the right people to move up, but somehow not New Yorkers. Whatever that was code for, they were a little afraid. And the president of Bridgeport Brass wrote an article, his name was Herman Steinkraus, and he said, what we're against, we want the Merritt Parkway because it's this almost sort of garden-like road, but we don't want what he referred to as a truck highway, which is really what they got when they opened up the Connecticut Turnpike. And he wrote this, our neighboring state of New York, which does things in a big and overpowering way, has already ruined some of the little lovely towns which are near the Connecticut border. Take Portchester as an example. Are we going to make the same mistake and spoil lovely towns like Westport, Southport, and Fairfield because of the overpowering pressure to have more and more trucks coming through our highways day and night? He wrote this in June of 1944. So, yes, they wanted this to have a residential future, which they thought would boost the economy, but they were trying to be careful about all this. And it occurred to me that just like the Merritt Parkway, which opens the same year that the magazine begins, the Merritt Parkway very, very decidedly, very self-consciously bypasses Bridgeport. You don't want it to go through Bridgeport. Who wants to see Bridgeport? You want it to go through lovely wooded areas. It's built there for a reason. And just as they were bypassing the shoreline over there, they were bypassing Bridgeport, they were also bypassing any part of the history they didn't want. They didn't want the 19th century state, they wanted the colonial state. And if you look around the state, yes, it's a colonial state in many ways, it does have this older history, but you take a town like New Canaan, and I had a fellow who's now a professor of architectural history, and he wrote a paper for me many years ago, and he said, you know, in New Canaan, they very carefully rebuilt the town in the 1920s and 30s. It used to be full of brick buildings. It was a quasi-industrial town. They took them all down, and they replaced them with faux colonial. If you look at all those buildings, you think they're old? They're not. They were, most of them, from the 20th century. So they rebuilt it to look colonial. So that's what's going on here. It's a kind of rebranding. They're bypassing Bridgeport, they're bypassing the 19th century. So this is what they're selling. And in the book, you will find all these articles. For example, one title is, Two City People Make Good in a Small Town. Another one, Where Famous Friends in the City Find Rest and Recreation in Rural Connecticut. Another one from 1939 said, Weekend Winter Dividends from Your Summer Home Investment. And here's a quote, what is most important, you will know brief escape from crowds, noises, vibrations, odors, the weariness, the fever, and the fret of city life. I like that. That's what you get in New York. Crowds, noises, vibrations, odors. In Connecticut, no bad smells in Connecticut. It can be a little lonely, they said, but you will be altogether at peace with yourself. And the covers said it all, so I'll just show you. Here are three of the covers, and we reprinted all of these in the book. This is one of my favorites. You see here a typical Connecticut person. I'm sure we're all like that. That older woman on the right. And she has two servants to help her with the gardening. This is what we're going for. And then we have, now, who wouldn't want to move up to Connecticut with an image like that? Come on. And then we have Katharine Hepburn. Here she is, looking so Connecticut. It was all perfect. So Katharine Hepburn had it all. And here was part of the dream. She was herself a good Yankee. She was a native of the state, but she was also a celebrity. That's the best part. She makes her living in Hollywood, and then she lives in Connecticut. So there was an article on Edna Ferber, who wrote Showboat and was a famous playwright. But it didn't talk about how she wrote things. It showed her, and there was a wonderful picture, she lived in Westport, of Edna Ferber tending her garden. That's what it was about. And what I love here is that at the very same time as the magazine is promoting this kind of rebranding of the state, Hollywood gets into the act. So here you have a movie from 1945 called Christmas in Connecticut. It's the Christmas state. Here's Mr. Blandings builds his dream house. And probably the most famous of all, Holiday Inn. There's Bing Crosby, Fred Astaire's in the movie. So it's the all-American Yankee state. And Hollywood is helping promote it. It's like, boy, you want something that's kind of old-fashioned, the perfect place for Thanksgiving or Christmas, you got Connecticut. And at the same time, another resident of Connecticut, Leroy Anderson, who was living in Woodbury, Connecticut, writes the famous Christmas song Sleigh Ride. You remember Sleigh Ride? With the sleigh bells and all that. So it's written in Connecticut, so it's just perfect. As I was sort of putting this all to bed, I looked again at the title of the magazine, Connecticut Circle. And a couple things occurred to me. Connecticut Circle. So Connecticut is not so much a broad avenue of progress, not that things aren't invented and made here, but it's really sort of like a peaceful suburban cul-de-sac. It's the circle, it's Connecticut Circle. Not a bad place to raise a family, rather nice. Occasionally visit Boston of New York, and I think one of my lines in the book is, Connecticut is kind of the suburban pause that refreshes between New York and Boston, but that's a lovely thing. You know, if that's the destiny, it's like we can embrace that. It's a wonderful place to be. And it is close to all these cities. If you're a Red Sox fan, if you're a Yankees or Mets, you can get there, you go to the ballpark, come back to Connecticut. So this is, I think, what they were trying to sell in the late 30s. This is the image they're trying to do. And the last thing that occurred to me, if this is true, if I'm right about what they were trying to do at this point in time in 1938, then the Merritt Parkway is kind of like the yellow brick road. And then I looked at Harry Franklin Morris, the publisher, and son of a gun, he looks just like the Wizard of Oz. So I got on the internet and I looked and said, when did the Wizard of Oz come out? The magazine's 1939. So it's all the same period. So it's the dream. It's what's at the end of the rainbow. Here we are in Connecticut. So I'll stop there. So, yes, questions, please.
Your book title and the title of your talk involves cul-de-sac.
Mm-hmm.
Is Connecticut more in favor of or has more cul-de-sacs than any other state in New England?
It's a great question. I wish somebody had counted them. My guess is that we have a fairly high percentage of cul-de-sacs. Cul-de-sacs were not invented here. It was actually invented by a New Yorker, a guy named Stein, Clarence Stein. He talked about the hierarchy of roads, and it was something that he started thinking about in the 30s, that you should have the busy roads and then slightly more local roads, and at the end, the smallest road should be a cul-de-sac, and his idea was it's a place for children to play, so they can be safe from traffic. It's a wonderful idea. People who are called the new urbanists contest this. They think this is not such a good idea, that it's better to have through roads. But getting to your question, cul-de-sacs were very big here. I know, again, no one's counted. Whenever I mention cul-de-sacs, people say, oh yes. I think there are a substantial number of cul-de-sacs here because I think Connecticut residents in general do value their privacy. And it's a way of ensuring more privacy. This, I can also tell you, that the traffic circle was absolutely invented here by a man named William Phelps Eno. And he invented this in the 30s. So he was the first one to come up with the traffic circle. I don't mind cul-de-sacs, I don't love traffic circles. But he actually designed the Champs-Élysées in Paris. But he was from Connecticut. So Connecticut has been in the forefront of circular roads, for what that's worth. Yes.
Yes. I'm wondering if you could expand on who the they is that's doing the rebranding in.
Absolutely. Well, Harry Franklin Morse, who was the publisher, as I said, he owned several. He came from a very wealthy family of shipbuilders in Maine, and he moved down here because at that point his father's vast enterprise. His father actually wound up in a federal penitentiary for stock fraud. It's another story, but he owned several shipyards down here. He had missed his calling. He was a publicist by nature. So at the same time he was putting out this magazine, he started putting out brochures directly about real estate. So to answer that question, I would say Morse's allies were the same people who were involved with the Merritt Parkway. And it didn't escape my notice when I was doing research on this, that as he's beginning this magazine, and right before the Merritt Parkway opens, he buys up a lot of property that abuts the Merritt Parkway. No fool, Harry Franklin Morse. So he was ready for all this. So Governor Baldwin, and there's sort of like a little Republican group that kicks out Wilbur Cross. And one of the people, what's his name, Pryor, Samuel Pryor. So Samuel Pryor is probably the biggest of the bosses. Samuel Pryor worked for Juan Trippe and Pan American Airlines. He was from St. Louis. He moves to Greenwich. He becomes not only an important Republican National Committee man, but also probably the political power of the state. So in a sense, what I'm seeing here is between the Merritt Parkway, which by the way, people in eastern Connecticut were not happy about, because it didn't help them at all. It really bypasses them. It goes up that way towards Boston. So they didn't want the state to spend the money on it. So they were protesting all this. And what you see, I think, in 1938 is a shift in the political axis of Connecticut. It shifts from the older part of the state squarely into Fairfield County. And so Samuel Pryor is one of these people that we're talking about. He's a power behind the throne. And another one is actually Harry Luce. All these fellows, by the way, belong to the Round Hill Club in Greenwich, Connecticut. And Juan Trippe, who Pryor works for, introduces Harry Luce to Claire Booth Luce, who he marries. And Claire Booth Luce becomes the Republican Congresswoman from Fairfield County. So if that gives you a little indication, there's a new posse in town. And there are people who have in mind the power of Fairfield County, the power of residential real estate. And I think that's where they're at. And most of them are corporate, and they work in New York, and they work for national corporations. So they're looking to sort of enhance the value of a kind of hideaway county in the western part of the state. That's what seems to me to be going on. Yes?
Yes. Does this also correlate to the soldiers coming home from war, marrying, and wanting to settle?
Absolutely, absolutely. And this is when you see, not just in Connecticut, but elsewhere, this is when you see suburbanization take off. The big place in the Boston area, for example, that's producing a lot of war material is, what do they call it? Metro West. You know, if you know Boston, I know Boston a little bit. But the Metro West area, the key part of Metro West is Framingham. Framingham had been the place where they produced the most war material during World War II. And after the war, this is the area that suburbanizes. Same thing in Long Island. The two aircraft factories, Republic Air Aviation and Grumman Aircraft. I had a summer job for a week and a half at Grumman Aircraft, making the F-11 bomber, I think it was. Worst job ever. And that is exactly the area where people start. So there's a connection between war production and suburbanization. In LA, the places where aircraft were being made was a little town, no relationship to Westchester County, but it was called Westchester right outside of LA. It was where the aircraft were made, and one of the families that grew up there produced the Beach Boys. What's their last name? Brian and Wilson, right? So the Wilsons, the dad worked in an aircraft factory in suburban LA. So you see an absolute correspondence between war production and suburbanization. And in the New Haven area, the first places to really start building up, before Woodbridge and Bethany, which are a little later, North Haven. You know, Hamden and North Haven, and it happens right after the war. Yeah. Yeah.
As part of the get us out of the Depression, the Work Progress Administration hired a bunch of writers to write state books, sort of tourist books for states. Was one written for Connecticut?
Absolutely, and guess what year it came out?
1938.
Yes.
Well, I thought it would, but I didn't hear anything.
Yeah, no, and in fact, when I was first trying to think of this together, I found it at either at Book Barn or at Whitlock's and said, oh, this is perfect, oh my God. So all of these efforts are happening at the same time. And this is part of, there's this kind of a national search for heritage and identity. So every state is doing this. They're trying to think about what's our history, what's our identity, how do we promote ourselves, especially, as you were asking, after the war, what's next? You know, what do we become next? And so, yeah, the WPA project is an absolute part of this. There was an Italian father and son team that made most of the beautiful bridges there. And a number of the bridges, and we have a picture of one or two of them, I think, capture the state's past. So again, you see history being used as a kind of commodity, as an amenity. So one of the bridges has an Indian person staring at it's a Puritan, just like the images on that program. So they're trying to use the past. It's like, this is who we are. We go back in time. You know, this is, and so, you know, I have taught Native history at Yale actually for many, many years. And I'm an advisor to the Native student group at Yale. And this is exactly the time when they're being kind of rediscovered, because they lend a kind of history to everything. You know, so it's an interesting, I won't go into it now, but it's an interesting story how the Pequots and the Mohegans begin to kind of save what remains of their tribal estate. And they're able to make certain claims and make a certain push, in part because the state realizes it wants to hold on to its history, its past, and Native people are part of it. You know, but it takes a lot of effort on the part of Native people. And one of the women who is in the forefront of this, her name is Gladys Tantaquidgeon, thank you. Ginny and I visited her on our honeymoon, on the way to our honeymoon destination. We stopped and visited Gladys Tantaquidgeon, who was already in her 90s. And I think Yale gave her an honorary degree when she was 99 or 101. And her great niece actually still comes and blesses certain events at the Native Student Center. But she was one of the people who was intimately involved in preserving the history. So from that standpoint, she's doing something similar. It's an effort to keep the heritage. You know, how do we keep this? And she started a museum, long before there were casinos, she started a museum in her house, keeping a lot of Mohegan artifacts and all of that. So she's a fascinating person, Gladys Tantaquidgeon. I saw another question there, yes.
Yeah, I'd always heard that the Merritt Parkway bridges were a WPA project. Is that not true?
They do use part of that money. There's a lot of complicated financing. As you can well imagine, yes, the state is going to use, as every place does, uses federal funds.
This father and son designed most of them. They weren't designed by different people because they're each so different.
There are different people, but they did a number of them, and some of the nicest ones, I think. There's more details, I don't recall them off the top, but, you know, he was I think a professor of sculpture or something at Yale, and brought his father into it. So yeah.
With the building of the Merritt Parkway, were trains then, did they increase Metro North?
Oh, that's a very complicated. This is the time when the New York, New Haven, and Hartford line starts entering its decline. It goes bankrupt in 1961. Funny you should ask us. I've just been reading a history senior essay about Metro North and how it comes about. It's torturous. So the Hartford, New Haven, and New York line starts descending, in part because people are commuting more by car, and with the Parkway, but even more so because they still have a fair amount of traffic for going to work and coming home. But women stopped using it because of the building of suburban shopping centers. And they had counted on women using the train at off-peak hours. They would go to New York to go shopping. So when they stopped doing that, their revenues really, because they had to maintain the railroads 20, more or less all day, but there was no revenues at off-peak times anymore. So they go into decline. It's a long, complicated story. The New York, New Haven, and Hartford is eventually taken over by Penn Central. Penn Central goes into bankruptcy about a year later. They're taking off. How many people remember Conrail? So Conrail is next. Conrail stops, and then finally it's what was it today? It's Metro North. And it also involves the MTA and a power struggle between Rockefeller and Robert Moses. And Robert Moses, by the way, was born in New Haven. So it's a very complicated story.
Is he the one that did the Bronx, the buildings in there?
Yes, yeah, exactly, yeah. Although, having grown up in Jones Beach, it's a bit of an urban legend that he built the bridges too low so buses from New York City couldn't get there. Yeah, that's not true. The buses actually can get there. I went to Jones Beach all my life. There were people from the Bronx at the beach all the time. So that's something Robert Caro actually kind of made up. Not that Moses he was an absolute autocrat. There's no doubt about it. He did lots of other things, but he didn't do that. And Jones Beach is very nice, and he actually chased out a lot of rich people to be able to build Jones Beach. So he didn't just go after poor people. He was an equal opportunity megalomaniac, if that helps. Yeah. Yes.
Could you comment on the degree to which the access that the merit affected the cultural and artistic life of this area? I know New Haven's always had a very vigorous jazz scene.
Oh, that's a great question. It's one that I care about a great deal. My sense is that the merit doesn't affect that particularly. I don't think the highway affects that. My guess from some study of this is that what really is the most harmful to the jazz scene, not just in New Haven, and there's complicated factors in New Haven, but the New York jazz scene is the big jazz scene, Birdland and 52nd Street and all of that. That goes downhill. But it's not so much, I think, because of the car. It's really because of the plane in Las Vegas. Las Vegas becomes this national entertainment center, and local entertainment centers take a nosedive after this. So I think it's really the popularization of air travel that affects that as much as anything. But it's so much more complicated than that, because having been a member of the Musicians Union for over 50 years, I can tell you, part of what killed entertainment in New York was cabaret taxes, entertainment taxes that the city was putting on. In New Haven, it's a very complicated scene. When I first came here, I switched my membership from Local 802 in New York to Local 234 in New Haven. But when I first came here, there were two locals in New Haven, 234 and 486. There was a white local and a black local. So they were segregated musicians locals, even though everybody knew each other, people played together, but there were two different unions. And there have been attempts over the years, especially in the old days, there were a lot of clubs like McTriff's. There was a pretty good jazz scene here. It's still around, it's not great. I think I wouldn't blame transportation, I would blame television more for that. People stay home to watch TV. That's what kills things in the picture. That's my guess. I don't know if anybody's ever totally figured that out. It's something I care deeply about, so it's a complicated question. Yes?
You've alluded to real estate speculation and the importance of that in this particular era, particularly the post-war era. Can you talk, or is there someone who will be able to talk about specifically redlining in real estate, either pre or post-war? There certainly are some pretty serious books, Mapping Decline by Colin Gordon, about about real estate speculation and redlining in St. Louis specifically, but the same is true in Chicago and Kansas City.
Well, again, I just read another senior essay that talks about urban renewal in New Haven. So this is something a little different. So here we're talking about the building up of Fairfield County. So we're not talking about the decline of the inner city. So it's a slightly different.
But they're coincident. I mean,
they may be, but I don't know that
and
I don't personally think that one causes the other. There is white flight is a very complicated phenomenon. It happens as much in the 60s as it does right after World War II. To me, a lot of what's going on is a housing crunch. Soldiers are returning, people are looking for an affordable place to live. And so they tend to look at the new housing, whether it's in New York or in Connecticut. I think that's part of it. Another part of what happens to downtowns is that a lot of the residential spaces are very old. Many of them, I just saw a figure in this student's paper, there's over 60% of the residences in the Dixwell neighborhood lacked bathtubs or hot water or any kind of really modern plumbing because older homes didn't have bathrooms. Typically, an apartment or a house didn't have a bathroom until around 1910. So anything older than that needed to be retrofitted, which was very expensive. So it's very complicated. Now, to get to redlining, not to go off too much of a tangent on this, but redlining is a thing. There were marks given, just in case you don't know, but I'm sure many of you do, what's called the Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC, is part of the Federal Housing Act of 1934. And they create a kind of way of evaluating downtown real estate. They were given codes, and that's why they call it redlining. Red was bad. They also given grades. D is the worst grade you can get. Most of Dixwell, for example, was given a D. Part of what was interesting in this paper was that Dixwell, for example, was already historically a black neighborhood. It was a primarily black neighborhood. There was some white people living there. Some did move away, but it was already primarily a black neighborhood. One of the things he argues in the paper is that, and you can see this as a negative producing a positive, or you can see it as a double negative whammy, that when a neighborhood is redlined, that means it has the opportunity to get federal funding for urban renewal. So you could see that as a good thing. As Douglas Ray, who wrote a wonderful book, I think it's the best book on a city, but it happens to be about New Haven, it's just called City. It's a fabulous book, and Doug's an old friend. And he says, if a neighborhood is redlined, it opens the spigot of federal funding. Because you're a disaster area, and therefore you can get funding. Again, you can see that as a good thing. You can see it as a doubly bad thing, because oftentimes people are dislocated when they do urban renewal, and they build things where, in the Dixwell area, they build this whole project called the University Dixwell something or other, and they take away housing. People have to double up. It just makes things. What happens? The end result is that the Dixwell neighborhood actually declines even further. So, again, is redlining a part of this process? Sure, it's complicated. But again, to get back to this story, the people who are moving out to Fairfield County are, for the most part, not the people moving out of places like New Haven. Okay, they are people who were. Mr. Blandings builds this dream house, on the other hand. They're a couple with their two girls. They live in Manhattan, and they have an urban middle-class lifestyle. It's almost hard for students today to imagine, oh, you could be a middle-class family and live in an apartment house in Manhattan. And of course, the big joke, the sight gag in Mr. Blandings builds his dream house is that there's no space. Why do you move? At least in the movie, it has nothing to do with race, and I'm pretty sure it probably didn't have anything to do with race, or very little. It's all about, the joke is that he keeps opening his closet and everything falls out. It's like, oh my God, I can't stand this anymore. And so that's why they want to move to Connecticut, where you can have some more space. And a lot of people, when you look at at some of the sort of suburban autobiographies, that's what gets mentioned a lot. We wanted space, and we wanted something new. We wanted something new for our families. So, again, I don't think redlining is a huge part of this story. I think there are two parallel and somewhat coincident phenomena, which is not to say people don't move out of cities and into suburban areas, but Fairfield's I think it's its own phenomenon, if that makes any sense. It's complicated. Complicated question. It's a hard question, really. But I'm not sure what's been written about that has always analyzed the question, because I used to teach a class at Yale called Suburbanization of America, and I did that for 15 years, so I think a lot of what's been written about that has been somewhat simplified. I think it's more complex. That's it? You've had enough? Okay. Well, thank you very much.